So, hello everyone, welcome, thank you for coming. Looks like a full house. Well, almost. Well, considering it's lunchtime, so thanks for coming. It's like people here at LastCon really care about DevSecOps, right? But this talk is about close encounters of the vulnerable kind. So basically, we want to talk about the kind of vulnerabilities we see in DevSecOps pipelines. So we have these CI/CD pipelines that we use and that have massively increased the attack surface, but we're not so sure if security is keeping up. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. I'm a principal security architect at Motorola Solutions. Before that, I completed my PhD in computer science at Michigan State University, where the topic of my research was ransomware and cybercrime. I speak at different conferences, and my research interests and socials are listed here as well. So a little bit about Motorola Solutions very quickly. It's because we're in a unique space. We're in the public safety market. So if you place a 911 phone call, the call routing software is Motorola. Then if the call handling software is Motorola, then the fire department, police department, emergency services, they all use Motorola Solutions equipment and software in one way or another. So as you can imagine, we are really big on security because the software vulnerability in one of our software can have big impact. So that's why we kind of take a deeper look into what DevSecOps is. So this is the agenda really quickly. So we'll talk a little bit about the topic at hand. So what is DevOps and how does security come into the picture? Then we'll discuss some of the common security risks that we've observed in the DevOps environments, and a little bit about the culture as well, and then conclude the talk. So very quickly, a disclaimer, these opinions stated are my own and not necessarily those of my employer. Tools are merely a means to an end, so treat them as such. I try to show open source tools where I can, but it's not necessary that those are the best tools for the job, especially if you're in an enterprise environment. You may need a different tool set, more enterprise-grade solution. All right, so with that, let's get started with DevOps. So modern DevOps, very quickly, what does it look like? So a simple example of a pipeline. We have automated testing. So a developer pushes or commits code. We have automated testing, that tests that get applied for functionality to test if the software functions as expected. Then there's a build that happens. Then we deploy in test environments. There's some further functionality tests that happen. And then we deploy it in production. So the overall chain of events is what we call the CI/CD pipeline. Anybody see what's wrong with this scenario? No security, exactly. So you got it spot on. So there's no security because those tests that you see, they're tests for functionality, which makes sense, right? If you're building a software, you want to make sure that it behaves as expected. But what about unexpected behavior when you provide inputs that are not expected? So there's no security. So we tried to inject security into it. So how did we do it? Well, we have a security person or security personnel sitting at the end of the pipeline. And basically, they're doing audits, assessments, reviews at the end of it to determine if the security is appropriate, if there's any security vulnerabilities. Then they are pushed back down the pipeline, ends up back in the DevOps cycle, maybe at the desk of the developer to address some of those concerns. And the problem with that scenario, well, there's many problems. Number one, then you're seen as security is seen as more of an impediment to business rather than helping business, because now, all of this work was done, and at the end of it, you're telling me that that this is wrong, that is wrong. You give me dozens of vulnerabilities or problems or issues, and I need to go back and fix. It just doesn't work that way. Then most of the time, the ratio for DevOps or developers to security personnel tends to be 100:1. So we don't have enough security personnel. So then it becomes like a bottleneck in the fast-paced DevOps environment where we're churning software quickly. We're trying to keep up with this fast-paced world, but the security ends up being a bottleneck. So that's not a good approach. So then we moved on to DevSecOps. So this is where we now are trying to bring security more to the left. So this is called shift left, where instead of trying to do security at the end of it, so at the end of the pipeline, we try to inject security at appropriate points throughout the pipeline. So the idea being that we still have the same pipeline, we're still building software, but now we have things such as pre-commit hooks. So perhaps we don't need to wait all the way till the end to tell a developer that, hey, you've accidentally pushed an AWS token or an API key in your code. So maybe you want to remove that. So maybe a pre-commit hook can do it very quickly before the developer has a chance to push that up the repo. Similarly, for software composition analysis, SAST and DAST, and we'll talk about some of these things in a second here. But the idea is that we now have injected security throughout the pipeline, made it a natural part of the DevOps cycle, as opposed to forcing it at the end and then delaying the business requirements and then other needs that we have to keep up with the fast-paced software churn-out. All right, so this makes a lot more sense. So this is what DevSecOps is all about. But then we have certain security risks in our DevOps pipeline still. With CI/CD pipelines being what they are, we have a massive attack surface now to manage, and we don't always keep up. So I'll go through some of the scenarios where we commonly see security risks occur in CI/CD pipelines. So one of the first ones that I want to talk about was dependency management. So I think the best example is what happened to us back in December of 2021. Log4j shell hit, and now management asks security teams the same question, no matter the organization: where do we use Log4j in our software, and are we vulnerable? We have to provide answers to our users, to our customers, to different folks, and security teams are running around scrambling, trying to find an answer to that question because it's not easy. If you're a small startup and you have a limited amount of software, maybe, but if you're a large organization, forget about it. Unless you're doing SBOM or SCA really well, in which case, congratulations. But so it's nothing new. Dependencies have always been a security risk. However, Log4Shell did bring it to the forefront that we need to think about our dependencies. So we have our application, which is that entire big sphere, and then we have our code that we actually write, the internal code that we actually write and manage within our teams or within our organizations. And then, so we have this living, breathing sphere, this little sphere of code that we manage. We're pushing, ideally, we're pushing security updates. We're constantly pushing new functionality. We're managing it according to the needs of our organization or our team. However, what about all of that other code that we're bringing in through third-party libraries? So maybe it's not up to the security standards of your organization, or it's not up to your needs and requirements. So who's managing that? So this is all to say that a lot of software exists in our application that is outside of our control. So vulnerabilities can trickle down, just like we saw in the case of Log4j, to our application ultimately through these libraries. Now, SCA can help. This is the software composition analysis, where you're trying to determine just what constitutes your software. It's not just that small sphere of internal code, but what else are you bringing in along with it in the form of libraries. So SCA hunts for vulnerable components. Now, there's many tools out there that will allow you to do SCA, perform it effectively. I'll show you some examples. OWASP has a dependency checker that you can use, but since I thought everybody's perhaps already familiar with that one, I thought I'd show a different one. So the idea is all these tools basically should do the same thing. One, they should tell you what kind of libraries are you using in your application, third-party libraries. Second, what versions of those libraries are you using? And third, are those specific versions vulnerable? So if they are, then you can go and fix them. So fourth, it can also tell you how to mitigate those detected vulnerabilities. So in this case, we have all of these repos, and then the top vulnerability looks like over 200 in that first repo. So we drill down to the details, and ideally it should show us something like this, where we can go down to the individual repo, the vulnerabilities discovered. Okay, this one looks like it's a big CVE with a CVSS score of 9.8. I probably should fix that one. And but how do I do it? So, well, there's a suggested fix. Looks like we're using Growl in this case. That's the third-party library, which that specific version has a weakness. And so it suggests that we upgrade to a better version where that specific vulnerability is fixed. So in this case, it's a simpler fix. In some other cases, it requires some effort. But you get the idea. You need to know what libraries exist, what vulnerabilities exist in those libraries, and then how to fix them. So that's the idea of SCA, or software composition analysis. Next, we move on to static analysis, security testing, in short known as SAST. So this is a white box test of your source code, of your internal source code. So then it's white box because you have the application, or this testing tool has the source code for your application available. And it tries to do analysis, structural analysis, different kinds of analysis on the source code to determine if there's any vulnerabilities. So it's a good first pass to perform. Obviously, it's not perfect because of its nature. It's not easy for a software to analyze another software, code for another software, and tell you if it's vulnerable or not. So false negatives exist. Some things will skip past the checks, and then you need to perform some security training as part of how to use the SAST tools. But perhaps the biggest problem with these tend to be there's a lot of false positives, and that leads to alert fatigue. So if your developer teams or your DevOps teams are constantly getting inundated with these alerts about these, supposed security vulnerabilities, they go look at it, and the first dozen of them, they're all false positives, and they come back and tell you, well, you know what, I'm not going to take a look at it anymore. So they either turn that off or try to bypass that, and therefore, then we need to do some configuration. Perhaps there's some tuning that needs to be done, or you need to do things differently depending on your environment in order to best use these tools. So just a word of caution there. So I thought I'd show some examples. There's language-specific SAST tools you can use. So if most of your code you write, let's say it's in Python, then in that case there's this tool called Bandit out there, which loads up that Python script, tries to tell you what kind of vulnerabilities exist in the code. In this case, read 12 lines of code, found one medium severity of vulnerability, and it's trying to tell you that it's highly confident that that's a medium security vulnerability that you need to go fix. So similarly, on the right, you'll see Brakeman. That one exists for Ruby on Rails. So it has a similar job that it does. It found a bunch of XSS, it looks like, in this specific case. And so you get the idea. These are software that analyze other software or source code for other software and tell you if it's potentially vulnerable. So there's more enterprise-grade SaaS solutions. Like I said, I like to show open source where possible, but sometimes, depending on the size of your organization, your team, your code base, you may need to move to an enterprise-grade solution. And CodeQL by GitHub is a popular one where it becomes a natural part of your CI/CD pipeline where you call that specific CodeQL action within the pipeline as you're building the software. And it performs those checks, tells you, in a nice dashboard that you can log into and view the kind of alerts or vulnerabilities that it found as potential problems. And then you can try to go fix those problems. So in this case, just showing you an example, looks like it found 30 or so alerts. And then within that, it was able to find this specific, if you drill down into details, this specific XSS where it's trying to show you that you probably need to sanitize your input. So that's an example of SaaS tools. You can then move on to DAST further down the pipeline. So this is a more holistic review of your application when it's deployed. So that was a static review of the source code, so it misses the context and the environment in which your application may be deployed. So in that case, you need to move on to DAST. It's a more gray box / black box approach because in this case, source code is not really available. It's a deployed application, but it's able to detect deployment-related security risks that SaaS tools would miss. So may require complex configuration at times. I'll show you why in a second, but again, false negatives exist because if the application behaves, it has a security vulnerability, but an input is provided to the application, and there's no apparent reaction although the vulnerability exists. So then in that case, we call those blind bugs, and they're not always detected by these DAST tools. So know the limitations. A popular DAST tool is Burp Suite. So Burp Suite acts as a proxy in case you haven't used it. It sits between your browser and the website or the application you're testing, and then you can stop and interrupt those requests going in, and then manipulate them, send them to various forms of analysis engines that they have in there. On the right, I'm showing an example of one specific one that I was using not so long ago, where I think I was trying to set the payload. That's hex for dots, and I think this is where I'm trying some kind of path traversal. But you see in the figure on the right down that we have a different error message for one of them. So in security and in programming, we know that a different error message means success. We've made progress. So 404 for a lot of them didn't work, not found. 501 for one of these other ones, and it gives me an error message which tells me that, okay, well, it looks like a Ruby application. So again, it's a black box text, so I don't know what exists on the server and how it's behaving, but it's all relevant. So, but you can imagine how doing all of this. So this is the manual side of it. And you can do a lot of, you can go very advanced with it. But on the other hand, there's also automated DAST solutions that are part of Burp Suite, where you can perform more automated analysis. It depends on the kind of resources you have at your disposal. Another tool would be OS Zap, another popular tool out there. Similar to Burp Suite, provides you an option to do automated scanning and manual exploration. Has a lot of add-ons that you can install from the marketplace, depending on the kind of needs for what you want to detect, how you want to identify the vulnerabilities. Again, all of that is, as you can imagine, there's a lot of customization required that I was talking about earlier, where you need to set things up. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. It depends on the needs of your organization, your team, how much time you have, and how much detail you want to go into. So this can very easily turn into a full-blown pen test. So many times pen testers use OS, Zap, and Burp Suite kind of tools anyway. So, all right, so with that, let's move on to IAC security. So IAC is infrastructure as code. It makes sense for us to have a consistent and reliable form of bringing up infrastructure every time we are deploying the infrastructure. So you may know them in the form of YAML files that you may have where you have those specific instructions in a script, which tells a particular engine how to bring up the infrastructure, what kind of servers, what kind of configuration, networking do you need, and then you push that up the repo as well, probably somewhere. So these are also version controlled. However, because of all of that, you also need to manage the risk that goes along with it. So consider the scenario where you're pushing up this IAC YAML file up a repo, but then a lot of people have access to view the repo or manipulate the repo or edit the repo. So then that's not good, because you don't want random folks coming in there and performing attacks based on manipulating these IAC YAML files, where, for instance, they may inject malicious commands in there that get executed as part of the build when the build infrastructure is spun up, and then they can be used for all kinds of nefarious purposes like secret stealing and so on. So we have examples out there in the public cases for all of these kind of activities, by the way. So the idea was that it would be as easy as push button and receive bacon, but we all know in IT and security nothing is that straightforward. So the attack surface is massively increased, especially when you throw in container-based environments, such as a Kubernetes cluster. I read this joke recently where they were talking about how what gives people feelings of power. It's not money, it's not status, it's running your own Kubernetes cluster. So believe it or not, I've seen cases where there was no need for a Kubernetes cluster, but there was a Kubernetes cluster, and the people were adamant about maintaining that. So that's okay, I guess, but then we need to manage security around it. There's so much attack surface in those things because they're complex, the way they run, they're not well understood. That means there's a lot of potential for security vulnerabilities. There's secrets management as well. These CI/CD pipelines, they have a lot of components that interact with one another, and as part of that interaction, they need to authorize and authenticate to one another. As part of that authentication, they need to grab a secret that's probably lying somewhere and needs to grab it, present it to the component, and go forward. So where do we keep these secrets? We can I've seen all kinds of insecure or vulnerable practices, push it up a repo, now it's exposed there. Or somebody, while doing some testing in the CI/CD pipeline, had it display in console logs, and they never took it off after the testing was complete, and so now it's displayed in the console logs every time. So all kinds of things. Basic key hygiene that we use for private keys and secrets, we need to do it in the pipeline as well. So perhaps it's a better idea that if you have a secret that you're grabbing, that you need to grab to authenticate where one system or one component in the pipeline authenticates to another, perhaps we need to store that secret in a key vault or an equivalent solution, and then use a reference string that goes and grabs it every time, instead of putting the secret directly exposed in one of the configurations there, which somebody can easily read. So you would think that by now we have figured these things out, but we haven't, because a lot of the times in practice, these vulnerabilities exist, and these are real problems. So repeatedly, we come across cases where this is being done. So secrets management is another important attack vector. Now, secrets can be I was talking about a scenario where secrets are further down the pipeline, but sometimes a developer might accidentally push secrets up the repo, right? It's in the source code somewhere. Maybe they included an AWS API key or something, and then they're trying to push that up the repo. So then you can have pre-commit hooks or something that detects those secrets or tries to detect those secrets and fails with the message telling the developer that perhaps you shouldn't try to do this. So in those kind of scenarios, what becomes important is I found that tools often are not well equipped to detect different kinds of secrets that exist. Secrets come in all sizes, shapes, forms, and the tools are trying to play catch up because it depends on the kind of regular expressions you have as part of that tool that are trying to do pattern matching based on different kinds of secrets formats. And so, but that's besides the point. You should still use these kind of pre-commit hooks to discover secrets. So two of the examples that I like to use, Git leaks is a good one, has different kinds of rules for different kinds of secrets that it tries to detect. So in this case, it was triggered on AWS access token. That's the rule ID, and it found what potentially looks like an AWS access token. And so we'll fail with the message that, well, perhaps you should rethink what you're doing because it looks like you're trying to push a secret. Same for Talisman, just a different tool with the same purpose. In this case, it triggered two rules when somebody tried to push this specific file. Looks like the name of the file is .pem, so that's probably a certificate with a private key in there, so shouldn't push that. A second rule that got hit was it also looks like the content has a AWS secret key in there. So try to do these things earlier in the pipeline. Again, because of the reasons we discussed, shift security left, so it's quicker to resolve for DevOps or developers than later. Let's talk about build systems. Now, this is very interesting because build systems are trusted in the CI/CD pipeline. They're trusted in that chain of events that gets triggered when a workflow run is hit when you push a new software change or software modification. So it's important to understand the difference between ephemeral and persistent build systems. So you have ephemeral build systems where you basically have, well, let's talk about persistent first. So persistent systems, classically, there's a build server that's sitting somewhere, and its entire job is to sit and always listen for a build job that comes in. If the job comes in, it will build the software as part of the pipeline, and then it'll wait, keep listening. It's always up. It's like it's a server. So these are persistent servers. Jenkins is a good example. Allows you to install all kinds of third-party extensions. Not all of those are secure. So there's a lot of problems with it, which we need to be aware of. So an adversary can establish persistent on a persistent build server. We'll see an example in a second. Ephemeral, by comparison, they're more. There's a time component to them, so they get triggered as part of the workflow run. So if you've used GitHub Actions, for example, and you have that as part of the CI/CD pipeline, it spins up a container-based build environment, which gets triggered or gets built when your workflow is triggered. and then when you have that environment, the software is built in there. But then after you're done, poof, the container goes away. So that seems a better approach in certain situations where you don't need a persistent build server, because that means now you have this container coming up, building, then going away. So that's the difference between the two. It's important if you have a persistent build server. It's important to do patch management on the server and hardening. And also follow the principle of least privileges. If there's 20 developers or 12 developers on the team, perhaps not everybody needs admin access to the build server. Not because we don't trust our developers, but because if one of the developer credentials get compromised and an attacker uses that admin access to the build server to do all kinds of nefarious things. So an example is the SolarWinds attack scenario. So I've simplified the CI/CD pipeline here with just 3 components. We have the developer pushing the software up, and then these 3 components get hit. The testing is performed, then we build the software, and then we deploy the software. It's pretty straightforward. So now the interesting that happened with SolarWinds was an attacker was able to compromise the build server. So now that's a trusted part of the CI/CD pipeline. How that compromise happened and how they were able to gain access to the build server doesn't matter, because we know there's dozens and dozens of attack vectors, and build servers, just like any other system, have weaknesses and vulnerabilities, which is why it's important to patch them and harden them. But anyway, the attacker is on the build server. So now we have an attacker sitting there on the build server while your software is getting built, and basically the malware that they wrote was for this purpose was Sunspot. Now in the media, there was a lot of attention. So SolarWinds got a lot of attention in the media, rightly so. But we all focused on Sunburst, which is the malware that was pushed on endpoints. But Sunspot was the malware that was pushed on the build server, and that's where the attack originated. So what Sunspot did was it sat on the build server and looked for a process called msbuild.exe. It's a build process, as you can imagine, pertaining to Visual Code, Visual Studio. And then if the process is running, so how it determined that was it had a hash algorithm called elfhash, and it took the name of each process, hashed it, and then checked it against a specific hash that was hard-coded in their binary, and saw if it matched. If it did, then they know that msbuild is running. So some kind of software is getting built. So when some kind of software is getting built, what kind of software is it? So they were interested in specifically Orion. So is Orion being built? If it is, then extract the command line arguments from that msbuild.exe. So now you extract the command line arguments. Now break that down and extract the directory path of the software that they're interested in, Orion, because they don't know where in the file structure that software lies. So they extract that directory path, and they're able to now, what they're interested in doing is go into that directory path or that file structure, and then replacing our source code file where they performed checks on their end, where they've replaced or added malicious lines of code in addition to that source code file. And they have checked it on their end. They perform all the validations checks, because if for some reason they trigger an alert on your end, if something breaks, you're going to take a look, and then they might get discovered. So they did all kinds of checks to make sure that everything is valid and it will run and will build. And then that's how they transparently injected malicious lines in the build process as part of the build server. And now, because the build server is a trusted part of the pipeline, we have further down the pipeline a code signing task that is basically stamping all software that is being built by that build server. So now the malicious lines of code just travel down the pipeline, get stamped with that code signing action, assuming that whatever the build server is providing me is authentic. And now that's approved, and that gets deployed, and that's how we got malicious software deployed at endpoints. It's got the certificate, everything checks out. It's all code signed and everything. So these are the kind of scenarios which we need to think about as part of the CI/CD complexity today, where we have these build servers that are trusted in the pipeline, but then there's no additional checks being performed before we do any kind of code stamping or code signing. We are not hardening the servers perhaps as well as we should. perhaps we don't need persistent servers, and an ephemeral build server would do. Further, let's talk about access control. Access control exists everywhere, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, except that it applies to CI/CD as well. It's a natural part of CI/CD because we've seen cases where there are overreaching permissions. So not everybody needs to have admin access to every component of the CI/CD pipeline. And then if there's somebody who leaves a team today and joins another team, perhaps in the same organization, but they join another product team, they no longer have a need to touch this repo. Remove that stale access. You don't still need that access because then over time, somebody keeps collecting permissions in your organization. If their credentials are compromised in the future, you have all kinds of problems because they had access to everything. So please remove lingering stale accounts. There's local accounts being created outside the scope of the policies that enforce security practices in the pipeline. This is more of a culture thing where I think we need to have a conversation sometimes to make folks aware. Nobody tries to create security problems on purpose. It's more like we need to have a conversation sometimes to make folks understand just what the effect of that action could be. And peer review all changes. So anything in the pipeline that is being changed or any software that is being pushed up a repo, it's important to make sure that somebody, maybe an adjacent team member, is peer reviewing it. Sometimes 2 peer reviewers are good, sometimes 1. Depends on the context in your environment, but don't just let folks push up changes and gets integrated and merged immediately. This is good for functionality, but also for security. So think of access control as everybody has their different spheres of access, and even though they're on the same team, they may have different spheres of access depending on least privileges, etc. Documentation, and this is not something I always see in these kind of talks, especially when there's technical talks. There's not as much emphasis on documentation, although it's super important because. So I'm a security architect, like I've said. I come in and talk to teams. I'm not attached to a specific product or software team within my company. We do more general security architecture around the whole company. And we have hundreds of different products, software, et cetera. So if I'm coming in and talking to a developer team to understand their context, you could be the most intelligent person in the world, but without documentation, without taking time to understand the data flows, the infrastructure, the pipelines, the rules, the specific customizations they've done, the extensions being used, you cannot gain a sense of what the security risk or scenario looks like for that specific software that you're trying to assess. And so as part of that, it's good to have documentation, right? So encourage and incentivize teams to document. Little documentation is still better than no documentation. And do not try to seek perfection when documenting because it just never is perfect, right? A written document is never perfect. So just some do's and don'ts of documentation. If you see these kind of scenarios on the left, not good. So can I have some documentation? I am the documentation. No, because then I need to have meetings and then talk to you. You don't have time, rightly so. You're busy doing your own work. Perhaps documentation, light documentation is good. Auditors need documentation. Everybody's running around trying to find some piece of paper they scribbled on a long time ago. I've talked to program managers at times where I've tried to encourage your teams, maybe make it part of the CI/CD, the agile process, where you give developers some time at the end of the sprint cycle to document. Maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, whatever they need. Try to encourage them to do that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Nobody got time for documenting. So that's the wrong part of it. That's the wrong culture, right? So we need to incentivize team and encourage them to document. So even if it's all in your head and you know it inside out, you still need to document. So let's talk about artifact signing. Unfortunately, not as many people are signing today. So by artifact signing, I don't just mean code signing. I mean other things that are part of the CI/CD pipeline as well. Content trust validation is important. So anytime anything is pushed up, we need to ensure that the integrity of that component or that software artifact is good. So unfortunately, so I was attending a NIST talk by these authors, or one of them, and they presented this study that they did recently, and I was shocked to find that still less than 5% are signing their code out there. The paper is forthcoming, so it'd be very interesting to read. But that means that the rest are not signing, and then there's all sorts of validation issues that occur as part of that. As a security architect, when I've had conversation with teams, I've discovered that it's not that people don't want to sign or don't want to do the right thing. They do, but they need appropriate guidance at times. Perhaps as security folks, we need to document and write down the steps or the implementation details of how to sign the code. So don't just come in and preach, thou shalt sign that code. Tell folks how to do it. And that includes providing guidance, because there's a lot of different kinds of signing procedures depending on what your context is. So you could have an internal root of trust, or you have an external root of trust. So internal root of trust is, let's say a device is coming to life out in the field, and this is your device, and you need to ensure the integrity of its firmware. So then that root of trust lies within your organization, and that's a different procedure than an external root of trust where you're, let's say, making, you're pushing a driver or a DLL for Windows, and so that's where when you need to get involved with that Windows-specific process, the different process for iOS, and so on. So, and that's just the process. There's also details to be figured out within that as to where to keep the private keys, where to keep the certificates, and there's a lot of decisions to be made. What kind of key size should I use? What kind of encryption? Should I use elliptic curve, or should I use RSA? Should I use RSA 2048, or should I use 4096? Who's going to answer all these questions? So try to help out the developer teams as far as possible. Maybe you maintain internal documentation or internal standards on where and how to acquire this information, or what is, for your organization, maybe R04, the only options are either use RSA 4096 or AES 256 and above, an elliptic curve, these specific curves, and then hashes. Please don't use MD5. Put that in bold, in capital. MD5 hashes, my God. Again, NIST has provided guidance that you shouldn't even be using SHA-1 anymore, right? So it's SHA-2 and higher. So, but developers have their own focus. They're focused on functionality. We've done experiments where we've seen we put security people in developer role, and as soon as you put security people in developer role, all the security knowledge seems to vanish, and they're focused on functionality, and then it's all about all the security rules go out the window. So please try to understand that perspective, and try to provide guidance as detailed as possible. This is an example of securing a modern CI/CD pipeline. I like this one, so I threw that on there. This is the source. You can go check it out. I know it may not be very readable right now, but you can see, like, moving down the CI/CD pipeline, there's different places where you need to have different kinds of controls. And as part of those controls, some small security risk is being mitigated or managed. And to provide you some examples, we have the only accept commits signed with developer GPG key. So every developer has a GPG key, and if it's not signed with that key, then you reject that commit. So maybe try that. Control 3, for example, automation access keys expire automatically. You don't have to have access tokens that last your lifetime, right? So maybe they expire every 6 months or shorter than that, depending on your use case. Only dependencies from specific on-premise registries can be used. So this is when you're trying to manage that dependency-based risk we talked about, where there's a lot of other dependency-based risks as well, where, for example, dependency hijacking. Let's say there's a public repo, and somebody maintains it, and it's a nice public repo that's been serving us very well for all these years, but suddenly that developer's credentials are phished. They lose access. A malicious attacker comes in and injects some lines of code. Now you pull it. It's not good. So dependency hijacking, dependency typo squatting, where somebody sits on a misspelled dependency name in hope that somebody's going to come searching for this popular repo, and I've got this, I'm typo squatting this this misspelled name of that dependency, and I've injected some malicious lines in there. So a lot of dependency-related risks. Any critical or high vulnerability breaks the build, so can't move forward until you fix that. Validate artifacts. So that's the content trust we were talking about. PR requires at least 2 reviewers. That's that peer review we were talking about. And there's a lot of other things as well. If you have container-based environments, make sure you scan those container-based images to ensure they're free of vulnerabilities. So as you can see, CI/CD pipelines, a lot of attack surface to manage, a lot of considerations. So finally, let's talk about visibility. Visibility is really important. There's a lot of automation in the CI/CD pipelines, and that means that things get triggered magically, things happen in fast-paced, no human oversight whatsoever, which is good, because then you're pushing out software very quickly, which is what we need. But that means for security, we don't see much because it happens so fast. So then, because of that, we need to log and monitor events in a SIM system to enable threat detection and response. If something goes wrong, or if something is going wrong at the moment, and you need to detect that before something goes even worse, gets even worse, then in that case, you need to have these logs being sent to a central log management and analysis system like a SIM system. Adversaries persist where logs are absent. I think we all know this one. Collect metrics on vulnerability management as well. Most folks already know over here what SIM systems are, so I thought I'd show an example of vulnerability manager. There's different ones out there. You may know of Nessus, more enterprise-grade solution. This is another alternative, Archery. But the idea is that you take those, you collect metrics on what kind of vulnerabilities exist in your environments as part of your build processes, as part of your different components that make up your software, and then you try to address them with certain goals in mind that, well, we won't be able to resolve 100% of these within the next 2 months, but maybe we have a number and target in mind. So we are actively managing our risk. Ultimately, it all comes down to business, because we all operate in business sort of environments. So sometimes, so you can either accept the risk, and business makes a decision that, you know what, this is fine, we don't have the resources for whatever reason, we don't want to try to fix this. So the business signs off on that risk and accepts the risk. Better thing to do would be if you can mitigate that risk. Sometimes the mitigation is simple and happens, otherwise, other times you accept it. Or the third thing you can do with risk is you can transfer it. So in that case, you buy insurance or something and you transfer the risk somewhere else. So different decisions that need to be made. Business folks like to look at dashboards, so it's a dashboard. But it can also be useful for fixing and keeping track of your vulnerabilities. All right, so let's talk about culture. And this is important because we need to develop a partnership, right, between security and DevOps, and I have to say that because security teams are still viewed as external, and because of that small ratio of security personnel to developers, unfortunately, security folks are still seen as external to the developer operations or DevOps. And therefore, it's important to develop a partnership and do not come in with an adversarial attitude telling people that you're not doing things right. You need to do this and this. I don't like this, right? That's not going to work. Listen and don't preach security. Understand developer perspectives and constraints. I cannot stress the importance of this. If you go in a meeting and you're talking to developers or a team trying to assess their security, try to first understand why those risks exist. Sometimes folks may not be aware. That's fine. In that case, you try to bring it to their attention. But other times, they will tell you that they're aware, but these are the reasons it's not mitigated. And that's where you listen, because that defines the constraints of the problem. And within those constraints, you can suggest solutions. Do not suggest solutions that are outside of those constraints. Provide implementation details to enable developers. Second thing is, while you're suggesting the solutions, it's not just, okay, well, you've got this content trust related risk. sign your code, and then you go away. No, maybe maintain internal documentation where your security teams are writing detailed documentation on how to, let's say, depending on your use case is container image signing. This is the solution this is the internal standard that we have for that. And these are the implementation details for that solution. If you're iOS app signing, then this is the solution for that. So try to enable developers and not just preach. Create and support a security champions program. So we need to make security more of an integral part of the developer and DevOps cycles. So that means we don't need to have external security folks come in all the time. Sometimes it becomes necessary, but sometimes we have what we call security champions within the DevOps teams, where we take the time to gather interest. There's always folks interested in security on the DevOps side. So gather interest, in identify who those folks are, provide them training on awareness. Security is not their full-time job, but they are interested. So you can perhaps familiarize them with the OWASP top 10 and those kind of frameworks, and NIST CSF framework and those kind of things. And then they become the security champion of their team or their product team or software team. And then they advocate for security. Next time somebody within their team pushes a change up the repo, they look at it from a security perspective. And you have all those automated tools, and that's all fine and good. But then you also have this person. So there's a human touch to it, a manual review from a security perspective. So that's always good. I call this the golden order of impact. It's all about creating impact in your organization. Impact if we're security personnel, then it's about creating impact in terms of security. It's the people that matter the most. I think we've seen the golden order, golden triangle, where they're all kind of part of the system. But I think, in my experience, people are the most important. So you need to get buy-in from your stakeholders. So if you have a SaaS tool or a DaaS tool that you're recommending, but it's not working out in specific situation scenarios that your DevOps teams are using, then in that case, you need to get with those teams, understand what the issues are, and get buy-in for security and whatever recommendations and tools, policies you're suggesting. So that's your people on the front line. They are the ones who, so security is everybody's responsibility. So get buy-in. Next is process. So well-defined and easily adopted. If you make things so process-heavy that by the end of it, their business can move forward because you've made it super process-heavy. People need to understand what's going on and how to do it. Don't do that. It needs to be well-defined and easily adoptable. Otherwise, you need to scratch that and rethink the strategy for process. And then last is tools. So tools do help a lot, but they have limitations. And please do not fixate on tools, because tools can be substituted, and there are always better tools coming out. It's better to, so tools have three purposes that you should look for, three qualities: effective, efficient, and fast execution. So there's, for example, if you have a SaaS or DaaS tool that you're recommending, but for larger code bases that exist in your organization, it takes days for the scans to run. It's perhaps not acceptable. So fast execution is also important. Ultimately, I'd say that, especially in the security industry today, learn to separate fact from claims, from marketing claims. That's important when it comes to tools. But since we're talking about tools, I'd like to present the OWASP Cyber Defense Matrix. If you don't already know about this is good, because it lets you, so let's say you work as part of an organization and you're responsible for security, and you're trying to understand what kind of tool sets you have, and within that tool set, what kind of ground do you cover in terms of security risks. So this the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. That's part of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then what of those applies to devices, application, network data, and all of that. So you start putting tools in one of these categories, or perhaps multiple, depending on the tool. And then you try to understand where are the gaps. So then you better manage security. But also, from a business perspective, business likes to look at security as a cost center. So maybe there's redundant tool sets you have. Large organizations, believe it or not, have redundant tool sets where one siloed team is using a completely different security tool than the rest, and then somebody else is using. So it's a lot of resource wasted or money wasted. So perhaps you need to remove redundancy in terms of security tools. So it's good for that as well. So in conclusion, attack surface is wider than ever. I think we've discussed that as part of the CI/CD pipeline. So we need to realign our security efforts to incorporate these complexities, and then implement automated and manual security solutions. Automated are good for fast-paced environment, but manual sometimes goes more of a detail. And then you always need to tune, reassess, revisit, kind of improve, relearn, repeat. Like I said, do not fixate on tools too much. Identify gaps using a visual framework. The defense matrix that I just presented, but learn to separate truth from marketing claims. And ultimately, I will leave you with this thought. We always say DevSecOps, and that term is taken over now, but it seems to artificially inject security in the middle of DevOps when DevOps should, by default, have security as part of it, because we talk about doing security from ground up, but then we have this artificially injected sec into DevOps as if it's not a natural part or organic part of DevOps already. So with that, that concludes the talk. Thanks a lot for coming.